When I noticed the USB drive sticking out of his laptop, I didn't think twice. I thought it was mine, the one I use for work, for saving recipes, photos, little things that help me feel like I still matter in this house. But when I clicked it open, what I saw wasn't mine. Not even close. A folder named with just a date. I clicked. And there I was. Sitting in that dimly lit room, frozen mid-pose. My hair tied up. My face caught in a moment I didn't know had been captured. And behind the camera, him. My stepson. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my ears so loud, I was afraid he'd hear it from the other room. These weren't just recordings of me posing. These were intimate. Unspoken things. Things I didn't think he noticed. And yet there they were. On screen. Preserved. I closed the window. I ejected the drive. But the silence in my chest only grew heavier. Because my husband had been home for 3 days. And he hadn't said a word. Not about the drive. Not about the videos. Not about me. And I realized, maybe he knew. Or maybe he hadn't watched it yet. But the worst part wasn't fear of being caught. It was knowing what he might see. What he might finally understand. What I had become. Not out of lust. But out of need. Out of loneliness. And if you've ever tried to disappear quietly while still living under the same roof as someone you once loved, you'll understand. Let me tell you how it all began. But first, tell me in the comments, have you ever shared a home with someone who made you feel completely invisible? It was the sound of the front door closing that snapped me out of the stillness. The heavy, familiar thud that had once brought comfort now marked the return of routine. Of silence. Of being unseen. I remained by the window for a moment longer, watching as the car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared into the blur of the afternoon. Another business trip. Another stretch of days where I would eat alone, sleep alone, and fold laundry for 2 without hearing so much as a thank you. You don't wake up one day and feel invisible. It seeps in, quietly. It starts when your husband stops asking about your day. When your birthday passes with a generic message and a prepackaged gift. When your thoughts, your jokes, your touches are met with nods instead of eyes. I wasn't unhappy, not entirely. The house was comfortable. The bills were paid. There were no fights, no cruel words. Just absence. A clean, well-maintained emptiness. That afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and stared at the mug he'd left by the sink. Lipstick red ceramic with a faint chip on the handle. A Christmas gift from 5 years ago. I rinsed it out, even though he never noticed. The silence clung to me as I moved through the house, checking rooms for no real reason. I adjusted the picture frame in the hallway, the one of us in Rome from a lifetime ago. My fingers lingered on the glass. I barely recognized the woman in the photo. Her hair was longer, her eyes brighter. She looked like someone who had recently been kissed. I was still holding the frame when the doorbell rang. It was him. The boy, no, the young man, standing awkwardly on the porch, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a large canvas bag in his hand. My stepson. Taller now. Older. But with the same soft intensity in his eyes. "Hi," he said, offering a crooked smile. Dad said I could stay for a while. Of course he had. My husband had mentioned it briefly 2 weeks ago, during one of our disjointed dinners. He needs space to paint, he'd said between mouthfuls of salad. Our place is too cramped. I had nodded, distracted by the fact that he hadn't once looked up from his phone. Now he was here. In our doorway. With his sketchbooks and oils and a way of looking at people that made them feel seen. I stepped aside and gestured him in. Of course. Your room's ready. He nodded and walked past me, his presence leaving a wake of unfamiliar energy behind. Something shifted in the air. Later that evening, after the suitcases were unpacked and the small talk was exhausted, I found myself hovering outside the door of the guest room, his room now. It was slightly ajar. Inside, the yellow glow of the desk lamp lit up pages scattered with charcoal sketches. Hands. Faces. Backs bent forward. Movement captured mid-moment. He looked up and smiled again, a little shyly. I've been working on studies. Trying to get more detail in the body. It's hard without a live model. I hesitated. What kind of details? He laughed lightly. Shoulders. Hands. How skin folds when someone leans, how hair falls across a neck. It's all about light, really. There was no implication. No suggestion. Just a quiet honesty. But I felt a strange warmth rise in my chest. Not desire. Not yet. Just the simple, painful awareness that someone in this house still noticed the way a neck curves. I could help, I heard myself say. He blinked. You? I nodded. Why not? It's just for art. He seemed surprised, but not reluctant. That would be amazing. You sure? I told him I'd think about it, though the decision had already been made the moment I stood in that doorway. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. My husband hadn't called. Not a message. Not a check-in. I tried to remember the last time he'd touched me without a reason. The last time he'd noticed when I wore something new. The last time he'd said my name like it meant something. But memory can be cruel. It withholds what you want and floods you with what you'd rather forget. The next morning, I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in years. One with a neckline that dipped just enough to suggest I remembered how to be seen. I brushed my hair with more care than usual. Sprayed the faintest trace of perfume behind each ear. I told myself it was for me. But I wasn't sure I believed it. When I entered the small studio he'd set up in the converted garage, he looked up from his sketchpad, his eyes lingering just a second longer than necessary. Ready? He asked. I sat down. My hands folded neatly in my lap. The light from the high window spilled across my shoulders. I didn't know it then, but it was the beginning. Not of an affair. Not of betrayal. But of something far more complicated. The beginning of being seen. The garage was cooler than I remembered, with a faint scent of turpentine clinging to the concrete walls. I sat on the low wooden stool near the window, where light filtered in just enough to soften the hard edges of the room. He adjusted his easel, tilting it ever so slightly before stepping back to study me. His eyes didn't linger anywhere inappropriate, and yet I felt the heat of his gaze everywhere. I folded my hands on my lap, unsure where to look. The silence wasn't awkward, more like suspended. He moved with an easy rhythm, preparing his materials, sharpening a pencil, stretching his fingers. I caught myself noticing small details, how his jaw tightened in concentration, how his knuckles flexed as he blended a shadow. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was the thrill of being studied. Of mattering. Could you turn your head just slightly to the left? He asked quietly. I did. My neck ached a little from the angle, but I held the pose. There was something sacred about the stillness. In it, I felt less like a person and more like an idea. A shape, a presence, something worthy of being remembered. My mind wandered. I thought of how many dinners I had made, how many beds I had changed, how many times I had waited by the phone only to fall asleep with it untouched. He worked quickly, but with intention. I could see it in the way he'd step back every few minutes, eyes squinting as if measuring something intangible. He was so focused, so removed from everything except the lines he was creating. I envied that intensity. I hadn't felt that kind of immersion in anything in years. At some point, I shifted slightly. My leg was beginning to fall asleep. "Sorry," I said. He shook his head. "Don't be. It's fine. Want to take a break?" I nodded, grateful. I stretched my arms above my head, letting out a quiet sigh. The moment felt oddly intimate, not because of anything either of us had said or done, but because I had let him see me as I was. No pretense. No performance. Just a woman in a chair, trying not to disappear. We sat quietly for a while. He flipped through his sketchbook, and I sipped from a glass of water he'd offered. Outside, a breeze rustled the leaves. The hum of life carried on. But inside that garage, time slowed. "You're a very good subject," he said finally. "You hold still without tensing. And there's something in your face, it changes, even when you're not moving." I didn't know how to respond. A strange flutter stirred in my chest. Compliments from my husband had long ago turned to observations. Functional statements. "You're losing weight. You look tired. Did you get your hair cut?" But this was different. This wasn't about approval or aesthetics. This was about presence. I cleared my throat, trying to steady myself. "Thank you." He smiled, then looked down, almost embarrassed. "Sorry if that sounded weird. I mean it in an artistic sense." "I know," I said. "Still, thank you." He returned to his drawing, and I resumed my pose. The second session was quieter. More fluid. As if something unspoken had been established in the first. I lost track of time. At one point, I closed my eyes and let my mind drift. I thought of my younger self, how she used to dance barefoot in the kitchen while cooking, how she wore bright red lipstick just to go to the grocery store. Where had she gone? And when had I stopped looking for her? Eventually, he stopped drawing. I opened my eyes and saw him looking at me, pencil poised midair. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated. "Nothing. Just, this is probably the best work I've done in months." There was a stillness to his voice, a sincerity that pulled at something inside me. I nodded slowly, unsure how to respond without giving too much away. That night, I took longer than usual to get ready for bed. I ran my fingers along the row of untouched perfumes on my dresser, finally spraying one I hadn't worn in years. The scent brought back memories, of dates, of nights out, of stolen glances across crowded rooms. I slipped into my nightgown and stood in front of the mirror, studying my reflection with an unfamiliar intensity. I wasn't young. But I wasn't invisible either. The next morning, my husband called. A short conversation. He was already rushing between meetings, asking if I'd remembered to pay a bill, if I'd fed the cat. I answered automatically, noting the absence of any questions about how I was. About how I felt. He said he'd be back in 3 days. I didn't mention the art sessions. Later that day, I found myself humming while doing the dishes. A soft, tuneless melody that surprised even me. It felt like a thread connecting me to a forgotten version of myself. In the afternoon, I returned to the garage. He greeted me with a warm smile, and something about it made me feel lighter. Like stepping into a room that had been locked for a long time. "I thought today we could try something different," he said. "Just your hands. Maybe holding something." He handed me an apple, and I sat, cradling it gently. He adjusted the angle, then began sketching. The silence returned, familiar now. Comforting. As he worked, I watched him. Not with desire, but with curiosity. With gratitude. For seeing me. For allowing me to exist outside the narrow confines I had long accepted as normal. When we finished, he turned the sketchbook toward me. The hands on the page were delicate but strong, aged but graceful. My hands. But not the ones I used to scrub countertops or fold laundry. These were hands that held stories. Secrets. Hands that still had meaning. We smiled at each other, and in that moment, I felt something shift. We kissed. Just that. No declarations. No promises. A single moment, suspended in time. And afterward, we said nothing. He closed his sketchbook. I stood. The air felt different, but not heavy. Just full. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again. But this time, I wasn't wondering what I had lost. I was wondering what I had found. The following morning began like any other, with the slow rustle of sheets and the pale light creeping through the curtains. The room was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of old wood adjusting to the temperature. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible patterns above me with my eyes. My mind was anything but still. Something had shifted inside me. Not dramatically, not like a storm tearing through a house. It was quieter than that. A subtle realignment of gravity, like the first delicate tilting of the earth before a season changes. I moved through the house with new awareness. Not guilt, not shame, but alertness. As if every object now had its own echo, every routine act carried more weight than before. The coffee machine sputtered to life like always. The mail lay untouched on the counter. The cat weaved between my legs, indifferent as ever. And yet, the air felt denser. I avoided the garage that morning. Not because I didn't want to go in, but because I needed to breathe apart from it. I folded laundry. Watered the ferns on the back patio. Cleaned out the fridge. All the ordinary things that used to feel invisible. Today they didn't. Today I noticed the texture of the towels, the angle of sunlight on tile, the scent of damp soil. I noticed myself. Around midday, I sat by the window and watched the street. The same people passed by, the neighbor walking her dog, the delivery guy with headphones, the couple who jogged in perfect rhythm. Nothing had changed, and yet I felt like I was standing just slightly outside the frame. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for shadows to move. Long enough for the house to grow still again. When I finally made my way to the garage, I paused at the threshold. He was already inside, seated at the easel, flipping through his sketchbook with a furrowed brow. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he smiled, soft and unsure. "Wasn't sure you'd come back," he said. I nodded, stepping inside. I wasn't sure either. He moved aside a chair for me. Not the stool this time, but a comfortable, cushioned seat by the wall. I sat, folding my hands in my lap, unsure what today would bring. He picked up a piece of charcoal and glanced at me. "Today's not about poses," he said. "Just. I want to capture the way you sit. The way you think." I raised an eyebrow. "The way I think?" He shrugged. "It's in your face sometimes. The way your jaw tightens. The way your eyes drift." I laughed softly. I didn't know I was that obvious. "You're not. Most people wouldn't notice. But I'm looking." Those words sat between us for a moment, hovering in the quiet. I settled into the chair, letting my posture relax. He began to draw, slow and thoughtful. The room filled with the faint scratch of charcoal against paper, and for the first time, I felt no urge to speak. My thoughts wandered again. To my husband, still away on business. I wondered what he was doing, what hotel room he was sitting in, what conversation he was half listening to. I wondered if he'd noticed the change in me before he left. If he had sensed even a ripple of what was stirring inside me. Probably not. He hadn't asked about the paintings. He hadn't asked about the garage. He hadn't asked much at all. I watched the young man before me, head bowed, hands stained with graphite. So focused. So present. There was no calculation in him, no manipulation. Just the simple act of seeing. Of translating what he saw into something permanent. And I realized, maybe that was what I had been missing. Permanence. Not in the traditional sense. Not a house or a ring or a last name. But the sense that something I gave of my time, my presence, my being, could leave a mark. You were right, I said quietly. He looked up. About what? I do drift. He didn't reply, just offered the smallest smile and returned to the page. Eventually, he turned the sketchbook toward me. The drawing was rough, unfinished. But the expression on my face, it was real. Honest. Not composed, not posed. Just me. I stared at it for a long time. My eyes. My posture. The tension in my lips. It was all there. Even the parts one didn't want to admit. It's strange, I said, seeing yourself like that. Why? Because it reminds me how little of myself I see most days. He said nothing. He didn't have to. We packed up in silence, careful not to break whatever had settled between us. As I left the garage, I felt the cool air on my arms and realized I'd been warm the whole time inside. That evening, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. I removed my earrings, one by one. Unpinned my hair. Washed my face slowly, watching the soap dissolve across my cheekbones. The woman in the mirror didn't look dramatically different. But I saw something in her eyes now. A question, maybe. Or an answer. I went to bed early, curling into the sheets with the same motion I'd repeated for years. But this time, I didn't turn toward the empty half of the bed. I faced the window, watching the dark tree branches sway. In the quiet, I heard the soft ticking of the clock on the nightstand. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. The weather changed that week. The sky grew heavier with each passing day, as though the clouds were mirroring something in me. I watched the trees outside sway under the wind's pressure, their branches bending but never quite breaking. It was subtle, but persistent, just like the shift I felt inside my chest. My days had taken on a new rhythm. I woke earlier. I dressed with more care. I made fresh coffee instead of reheating the old pot. And I found myself walking toward the garage before noon, not out of obligation, but out of desire. Not desire for him, not in the way people rush to define it, but for that feeling of being in the world again. The version of me that came alive when I sat in that space. When I became something other than a background figure in someone else's story. That morning, the garage smelled faintly of rain. The roof held a subtle drip, rhythmic but not alarming. He was already there when I entered, seated cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a new sketch pad. He looked up, smiled, and then nodded toward a chair he'd set up beside the window. I wanted to try something in natural light, he said. I nodded and sat down. I didn't need instruction anymore. We had established a language that didn't require much speaking. The kind of language that builds between two people who begin to understand each other without explanation. He began sketching, occasionally glancing up, his hand moving with a confidence that still surprised me. I studied his face as he worked, not because I was searching for anything, but because it calmed me. He had a way of being present that made silence feel like a shared space instead of a void. As I sat there, my mind wandered, not far, just beneath the surface of my breath. I thought of the evening before, when my husband called. It was the third short phone call in as many days. He talked mostly about logistics. Meetings. Delayed flights. A new contract. He asked me to confirm a dentist appointment for him. Then hung up before I could say anything beyond "I will." I hadn't even told him our stepson was still painting me. Hadn't told him that we had shared a kiss. The omission clung to me, not quite like a lie, but certainly not the truth. And yet, it didn't feel like betrayal. Not exactly. What would I even be betraying? A routine? An arrangement? A silence that had lasted longer than most spoken vows? The scratch of pencil on paper pulled me back. I shifted slightly in my chair, not dramatically, just enough to feel the pressure of the seat beneath me. The movement made me aware of my own body again, of its shape, of its history. I wasn't young anymore, but I wasn't gone. That mattered. He set the sketchbook down and reached for a soft eraser. His fingers brushed against the page with a care that felt almost reverent. I wondered if he was aware of how much power that kind of attention held. Or if, to him, it was just part of the work. I hoped, selfishly, that it was both. We broke for tea. I brewed it in the kitchen while he stood outside under the covered patio, watching the rain collect in thin lines along the edge of the roof. When I handed him the mug, our fingers touched briefly. He didn't flinch. Neither did I. We stood there, side by side, the warm steam rising between us. For a moment, we didn't have to speak. The wind did all the talking. Back in the garage, he picked up another sketch and turned it toward me. This one wasn't a likeness in the traditional sense. It wasn't a portrait. It was me, but seen through his interpretation. There were lines around the eyes, tension in the jaw, but also grace in the posture, quiet strength in the curve of the back. He had drawn me as someone weathered, but not worn down. Someone whole. I stared at it longer than I intended to. I look powerful, he said. That word caught me off guard. I looked at him, expecting a smirk or a hint of irony, but his expression was sincere. He meant it. I don't know if I am, I said. You are, he replied, then added, more softly, you just don't see it yet. His words didn't fix anything. They didn't erase years of feeling invisible. But they landed somewhere deep. Like water seeping into a long dry well. That afternoon, I returned to my room and sat by the window, looking out at the garden. The rain had slowed. The soil looked dark, rich. I could see small shoots rising from the beds I had planted weeks ago. I had almost forgotten them. Funny, how things grow even when you stop watching. I spent the evening sorting through old photos. Not the digital kind, the real ones, stored in a worn cardboard box in the closet. There were images of vacations, birthdays, uneventful days in between. Pictures of my husband and me in younger years, smiling in front of landmarks, arms linked, sun in our eyes. We looked happy. And maybe we had been. Maybe happiness had simply worn a different shape back then. But in those photos, I also saw a woman trying to hold something together. Smiles that were a little too bright. Postures too stiff. I wondered what would have happened if I had let go sooner. Or if I had spoken out loud the things I had only whispered to myself. I put the photos back in the box and slid it under the bed. Later, I wrote a list in my journal. Not a to-do list, not chores or errands. Just a simple question at the top of the page, what do I want? I stared at the question for a long time. And then I wrote. To feel known. To feel whole. To be chosen, not out of habit, but out of want. To remember who I was before the silence. The pencil hovered after that. There was more I could have written, but I didn't need to. I closed the journal and set it on the nightstand. The rain picked up again during the night, tapping gently on the windows. And as I drifted to sleep, I felt something new settle inside me. Not peace. Not yet. But presence. The days that followed moved with a kind of quiet momentum, like a train gliding through fog. You know it's in motion, but the world around you feels suspended. Time stretched and curled in strange ways. I found myself more attuned to details, the way dust gathered on the bookshelf, how the light shifted in the hallway by mid-afternoon, the faint scent of oil paint clinging to my sweater long after I left the garage. I began to plan my days around those sessions, not consciously at first, but in the way you start anticipating something before you admit it to yourself. The moments in that garage had become more than practice for him, more than escape for me. They were the only parts of the day where I felt fully engaged, like I was part of something that mattered. And yet, I hadn't told anyone. Not my husband. Not my sister. Not even the woman at the market who always asked how things were at home. I kept the truth folded away, quietly, like a page bookmarked in a novel no one else was reading. That morning, I stood longer than usual in front of the closet. It wasn't about vanity. It was about intention. I wanted to feel like someone who still paid attention to how she looked, to how fabric fell on her shoulders. I chose a soft blouse I hadn't worn in years, subtle but feminine, with buttons that gleamed just faintly in the light. Not for anyone else. Just for me. The air in the garage was warm when I entered. He had opened one of the small side windows, letting in a gentle breeze that lifted the corners of paper and rustled through the hanging brushes. He looked up as I walked in and smiled, not wide, not expectant, but soft. Familiar. "Morning," he said simply. I nodded and took my place by the window. We didn't speak for a while. The silence wasn't heavy. It was careful. Focused. His pencil moved steadily, pausing every now and then as he adjusted his gaze. I sat with my hands relaxed, one resting on my knee, the other gently draped over the arm of the chair. My body had memorized these still moments by now, the way my back should curve, how long I could hold a pose before shifting. But inside, nothing felt still. I thought about the previous night. My husband had returned my call late, nearly midnight. His voice was tired, distracted, wrapped in whatever his day had held. He mentioned a colleague's retirement, a delayed flight, a hotel with poor room service. Not once did he ask how I was. Or what I had done. Or if I'd missed him. When we hung up, I'd stared at the phone in my hand for several minutes. Not out of anger. Out of recognition. It hit me, then, how rarely he left space for my world inside his. And now, sitting there, I wondered what he'd think if he saw me like this, still, composed, painted by someone else's eye. After some time, he leaned back and set his pencil down. "You can relax now," he said gently. I shifted, exhaling slowly as I rolled my shoulders. He handed me a glass of water, and I took it with quiet gratitude. The coolness felt grounding, something tangible to hold on to. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his portfolio and pulled out a new sheet. It was different from the others. Less precise, more expressive. The lines were bolder, the shading deeper. It was me, but not exactly. It was the emotion of me. A moment captured not in likeness, but in feeling. "I wasn't sure whether to show you," he said. "It's more personal." I studied it carefully. The woman on the page looked strong, but weary. Her eyes held something searching. There was beauty in it, but it wasn't delicate. It was raw. It's honest, I said finally. He looked relieved. I've never had a subject like you before, he admitted. It's not just about how you look. It's about how you carry yourself. Like, you've been carrying a weight for a long time, but still haven't dropped it. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We cleaned up in silence. I packed the sketch carefully back into the folder he'd brought it from, and he rinsed the brushes at the small utility sink in the corner. As I stood near the doorway, watching the afternoon light grow softer through the windows, I felt a sudden stillness rise inside me. Then I turned toward him. We kissed, I said. The words didn't hang in the air dramatically. I didn't whisper them. I didn't inflect them with meaning. I simply said them, like a fact that had been waiting to be acknowledged. He looked at me, surprised. But not alarmed. I know, he said quietly. We stood there for a long moment, the weight of the truth settling in. I needed to say it, I added. I'm glad you did. And that was it. No confessions. No declarations. Just a shared moment of clarity in a world that rarely offered any. I left the garage feeling unburdened in a way I hadn't expected. Not because anything had been resolved, but because something had finally been named. And naming things, I was learning, was a kind of freedom. That evening, I prepared dinner with more attention than usual. I diced the vegetables evenly, added fresh rosemary to the roast, even lit a small candle on the counter. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an offering to myself, to keep choosing presence over numbness. When I sat down to eat, the chair across from me remained empty. But I no longer felt alone. Later, I opened my journal again. I flipped past the question I'd asked myself days before and started a new page. I wrote. There are kinds of love that don't ask to be spoken. There are kinds of knowing that exist only in stillness. And sometimes, being seen, truly seen, is the loudest kind of intimacy there is. I closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf. Then I stood in front of the mirror, looked at my reflection, and didn't look away. There was a stillness to the day that felt unnatural. Not the usual quiet of our house, which had long become familiar, like white noise, but a heavier kind, like the air was holding its breath. I woke before the sun had fully risen, the early light dull and cool against the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, not moving, just listening. To the tick of the clock, to the distant hum of a car passing outside, to the silence within me. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps clarity. When I finally stood, I moved slowly through the morning. I prepared tea instead of coffee. I folded the blanket at the foot of the bed with more care than usual. I opened the windows just a crack, enough to let in the smell of damp grass and something faintly metallic in the breeze. There was no urgency in anything I did, but there was intention. Every action felt like a kind of grounding, a way to make sense of what I could not say out loud. I hadn't gone back to the garage the day before. I needed the space, not from him, but from the current that had begun to pull me somewhere unfamiliar. There's a difference between being drawn to something and being consumed by it, and I had spent too many years losing parts of myself in service of others. I didn't want this to be another quiet erasure. I wanted to understand what it was I was stepping into. And yet, I missed it. The smell of turpentine. The low creak of the stool. The way he looked at me, not with desire or expectation, but with recognition. I missed being a subject, a shape, a story worth translating into line and shadow. That morning, I walked through the house differently. I noticed the fingerprints on the fridge, the fading photograph on the mantel, the chipped tile in the bathroom. This home, which I had once curated with care, had become a museum of routine. Everything in its place. Everything slightly dulled by time. I stood in the hallway and let my fingers trail the wallpaper, tracing the ridges I hadn't felt in years. Then I opened the door to the garage. He was there, of course, already working. He didn't look up at first, his concentration deep, his pencil moving with practiced fluidity. But when he finally did, his eyes met mine, and the pause that followed was filled with more meaning than any greeting could hold. I stepped inside without speaking. I didn't take my usual seat. Instead, I walked over to the small table by the window, where his materials were laid out in quiet chaos. Tubes of paint, smudged paper, open notebooks. It was a space in motion, full of effort and trial. "I don't want to pose today," I said finally. He straightened a little but didn't look surprised. "Okay," he said. "I want to talk. Or rather, to think out loud. You don't have to answer." He nodded, setting the pencil down, folding his hands in his lap. He became still, but present. I sat opposite him, folding my legs beneath me like I used to in college, long before life demanded more structure. The sun had shifted by then, casting wide patches of light across the floor. The smell of oil and paper surrounded us like a cocoon. "I've spent most of my life keeping things steady," I began. "Making sure everything runs. That people are fed. That birthdays are remembered. That laundry is folded and hospital visits aren't missed." He didn't interrupt. His gaze didn't shift. "I used to think that was love. The doing. The showing up. The being dependable. And maybe it is. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what I needed in return. Or worse, I convinced myself I didn't need anything at all." I paused, drawing in a breath that felt heavier than I expected. I thought if I was good enough, things would feel different. That the emptiness would shrink. That someone would notice the effort and say, "I see you." Not for what I do, but for who I am. A long silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. And now, here I am, in a garage, telling all this to someone who's known me for less than a season. He spoke then, quietly. "Sometimes a season is enough." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the depth behind his calm. He wasn't offering answers. He was offering space. And that, in itself, was more than I had received in a long time. I stood, moving toward the large canvas propped against the far wall. It was unfinished. A loose outline of a figure of me, but softer, more abstract. Not a perfect representation, but a suggestion of presence. I ran my hand near the edge, careful not to touch the surface. "I think I'm afraid of becoming a memory," I said. "Of fading into the background so slowly that no one even notices I'm gone." He stood too, joining me at the canvas. "You're not fading," he said. "You're becoming." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. We didn't draw that day. We didn't need to. Instead, we sat on the floor, leaning back against the wall, watching as the light moved across the room, changing everything slowly, beautifully, and without permission. That evening, I received a message from my husband. A simple note, "Back tomorrow." Late. No greeting. No sign-off. Just fact. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I turned off the phone and set it face down. In the quiet that followed, I moved through the house with a new awareness. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in years. I dusted the corners of shelves long ignored. I placed fresh flowers on the dining table, not for anyone else, but because I wanted them there. Because I deserved beauty in my space. Before bed, I opened my journal again. I didn't write much. Just one line. Stillness is not the same as silence. Then I closed the book and turned off the light. And in the dark, I did not feel alone. I felt whole. The storm arrived just after dusk, announced not by thunder but by the slow, insistent hush of wind against the windows. I was already awake when the first heavy raindrops began to tap along the roof, a rhythm too steady to ignore. I sat in the dark of the living room, curled up on the corner of the couch with a blanket draped around my shoulders, watching the trees bend under the weight of the wind. There was something calming about storms, something that allowed everything else to go quiet. Like the world was finally loud enough to match the noise inside my head. I didn't feel afraid. I felt still, like I'd been waiting for the sky to break just so I'd have a reason to feel cracked open too. He had texted earlier that evening. Just a single line, the power might go out. I'm staying in the garage in case you need anything. I hadn't replied. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to answer something that wasn't really a question. The power flickered just after 10. A quick blink, then another. I stood and lit one of the tall candles I kept in the hallway cabinet for moments like these. The soft light filled the room with a gentle warmth. I moved slowly through the house, checking windows, securing latches. When I passed by the kitchen, I saw my own reflection in the glass, a quiet silhouette with tired eyes, one hand gripping the brass candle holder. I don't know what made me walk outside. Maybe it was the candlelight. Maybe it was the weight in my chest. Or maybe it was just that I didn't want to be alone when the storm reached its peak. The rain was steady but not violent. I wrapped myself in a shawl, held the candle low, and made my way across the patio. My feet moved almost of their own accord, guided not by decision but by impulse, like water finding a familiar path downhill. The garage door was slightly ajar. Inside, the air was warmer than I expected. He had lit a few small candles of his own, placing them carefully around the space. The flickering light danced across the sketches pinned to the walls, casting shadows that made the lines seem alive. The smell of paint thinner and wax hung in the air, softened by the scent of rain. He looked up when I entered. His eyes widened just slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. Neither of us spoke. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and stood near the workbench. The silence between us wasn't fragile. It was full. Heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we didn't need to explain. He gestured toward the armchair near the easel, and I walked over and sat. The candlelight made the space feel closer, more intimate. Not in the way of secrets or stolen moments, but in the way that two people can share a room and know they are both entirely present. The rain picked up, louder now against the roof, like 1,000 small fingers tapping a steady beat. The power had gone out completely. No hum of appliances. No glow from distant street lamps. Just the two of us, and the storm. He reached for his sketchbook. Not the large one he usually used for portraits, but a smaller, older notebook with curled edges and faded covers. He flipped through the pages, then paused on one. I couldn't see the drawing from where I sat, but I could see his expression change. Not sharply, just a subtle softening around the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. He looked up at me. And then I said it. We spent the night together. The words didn't echo. They didn't bounce or shatter. They simply settled into the room like they belonged there. Like they had always been waiting to be spoken aloud. He nodded, barely perceptibly, and then set the sketchbook down on the table beside him. Still, we didn't move. The night stretched around us, the rain painting long lines against the windows. I thought of my husband, likely asleep in a hotel bed, unaware of the shift that had taken place here. I thought of all the nights I'd spent in silence, waiting for meaning, waiting for someone to notice I was still here. And now, I was here. Fully. No apologies. No explanations. I looked around the garage and saw not just a room, but a history. A beginning. A mirror. Not of who I had been, but of who I was now, who I was becoming. He didn't try to touch me. I didn't try to explain. We sat that way for a long time, the only sounds the storm and the quiet rhythm of our breathing. Eventually, I rose. The candle had burned low, the wax gathered at its base like a collapsed hourglass. I walked to the door, opened it slowly, and stood beneath the awning for a moment, letting the cool air wrap around me. When I turned to glance back, he was still seated, his eyes on the floor, his hand resting lightly on the closed sketchbook. I stepped into the rain, let it kiss my skin, and crossed the patio slowly, deliberately. Inside the house, everything looked the same. But I had changed. The morning after the storm was strangely bright. The kind of light that felt too sharp after so much darkness, as if the sky had scrubbed itself clean and now wanted everyone to look. I woke before my alarm, though I hadn't set one. The sheets were tangled around my ankles, and the faint trace of rain still lingered in the air, clinging to the edges of the curtains like a memory that hadn't fully dried. I didn't rush to get up. I lay there for a while, listening to the subtle creaks of the house settling back into stillness. My body was sore, not from exertion but from the stillness of the night before, from holding more emotion than I realized. My hands rested over my stomach, and I stared at the ceiling, trying to name what I was feeling. It wasn't regret. But it wasn't peace either. It was something in between, like standing on the threshold of a room you'd never dared to enter, not knowing whether to walk in or walk away. The garage was silent when I passed by it later that morning. The door was closed, and I didn't try to open it. I didn't want to rehearse what had happened, or what hadn't. I didn't want to over-examine the pause in his eyes or the way we hadn't said goodbye. Some things didn't need to be touched again right away. They just needed time to settle. Instead, I turned toward the kitchen. The smell of brewed coffee greeted me, faint but grounding. I moved through the morning in practiced gestures, mug, spoon, window latch. The house was quiet, but not empty. I could feel the weight of what now lived here, not like a secret, but like a shift in atmosphere. Everything was the same, but none of it felt familiar. As I sat down at the table with my coffee, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a while, a small photo, tucked behind a magnet on the refrigerator. It was from years ago. A vacation. I was laughing, holding a drink in one hand, wind pulling at my hair. My husband stood next to me, arm around my waist, smiling in that polite, camera-aware way. I tried to remember how that day had felt. The photo said we were happy. But memory, I'd learned, often edits out the silences. I took the photo down and placed it on the table beside my mug. I studied it, tracing the outline of my younger self. I looked light in that picture, but now, I wasn't sure if it was joy or just the way sunlight played across the lens. It was nearly midday when I finally opened the garage door. He was there, as I suspected, seated at his desk with his head bent over a sketch pad. He looked up slowly, his expression unreadable at first. Then something softened in his eyes, a recognition, but also caution. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," he said quietly. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The air still smelled like last night, wax, charcoal, and something heavier underneath. "I wasn't sure either," I answered. He didn't move. He just waited. I stood near the edge of the work table, tracing the grain of the wood with one finger. My heart beat louder than I wanted it to, but my voice stayed even. "We don't need to talk about it," I said. "I don't even know what there is to say. But I want you to know. I don't regret being here." He nodded, and for a while, that was all. Then he gestured toward the easel. "I started something this morning. You might want to see it." I hesitated before approaching. The canvas was only partially filled, but the strokes were strong, deliberate. The lines were unmistakably mine, but there was something new in them. The posture was the same, the hair tied back, the angle of the shoulder slightly tense, but the expression was different. It wasn't sadness or joy. It was focus. Self-possession. A kind of awareness I hadn't recognized in myself until now. "She looks like she knows something," I said. He glanced over. "Maybe she does." I stood in front of the canvas longer than I meant to. My own image staring back at me, reinterpreted through someone else's eyes. It didn't feel invasive. It felt necessary. When I turned back, he was already seated, flipping through another sketchbook. "I should tell him," I said, not looking at him. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "I don't mean the whole thing," I added quickly. "Not every detail. But something. A piece of it. Enough to stop pretending everything is where we left it." He closed the book and set it down gently. "That's up to you." I nodded, swallowing the dryness in my throat. It wasn't just about the truth. It was about ownership. About whether I could look at the life I had lived and finally claim all of it, not just the parts that looked good in photos. Back in the house, I found myself moving more slowly. Every door I opened, every drawer I touched, felt like a question waiting to be answered. I moved into the bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed. The suitcase my husband used on business trips stood near the closet, half open from the last time he returned. I sat and looked at it for a while. Not as a symbol. Just as an object, another thing in the room, waiting for someone to decide what to do next. Later that evening, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and took out a notepad. I wrote his name at the top. Then I paused. I didn't know what the note was going to be. A confession? A warning? A request? Instead, I wrote a sentence I hadn't said out loud in years. "I don't know how to keep pretending this life is enough." I didn't sign it. I didn't fold it neatly. I just left it there, under the lamp, where he would find it when he got home. Then I went to the window, pulled the curtain slightly to the side, and looked out at the garage. The light inside was still on. And for the first time, I didn't feel torn between two halves of myself. I felt like someone stepping out of a frame. He came home late. I heard the car before I saw the headlights through the blinds, the steady crunch of tires on wet gravel signaling the inevitable return of something I hadn't quite prepared for. I stood in the hallway, barefoot, the light from the kitchen casting a soft rectangle across the floor. The house smelled faintly of tea and something distant, old cologne maybe, or the way fabric carries the air of another place. He didn't knock or call out when he came in. He never did. His keys landed in the ceramic bowl by the door, and his suitcase followed, bumping softly against the side of the cabinet. I didn't move. I waited, letting the sound of his arrival fill the house before I stepped forward. He saw me standing there. Nodded. Tired. Polite. "You're up," he said. I couldn't sleep. He gave a faint smile and walked past me into the kitchen. Opened the fridge. Took out a bottle of water. No questions. No acknowledgement of the note. Maybe he hadn't found it yet. Maybe he had and chose not to speak of it. I watched him from the hallway. The way his shoulders moved, the rhythm of his steps, the way he leaned against the counter as if the house were something to be endured rather than inhabited. He looked older. Not in a sudden, dramatic way. Just slightly more worn at the edges. A shirt that didn't fit quite right anymore. A pause that lasted half a breath too long. When he finally glanced back at me, I didn't look away. "There's something I need to say," I told him. He didn't respond, but he didn't stop me either. I stepped into the kitchen and took a seat at the table. He remained standing. I've been painting, I began, even though that wasn't exactly true. Or rather, I've been in the garage. With him. I didn't use names. I didn't describe what happened. I didn't dress it up with excuses. It started with posing. That's all. But it became more than that. Not a secret, exactly. But something that belonged only to me. He was still. Completely still. I'm not saying this to hurt you, I added. And I'm not asking you to forgive me, either. I just can't keep pretending I don't need something different. He didn't move. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he took a sip of water, set the bottle on the counter, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. I sat there alone for a long time. The house had never felt more silent. Not angry. Just vast. Like every room had stretched itself into a kind of waiting. When I finally stood, I found the note still folded beneath the lamp, untouched. I didn't cry. I didn't pack. I didn't break anything. I just stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching him lie down fully clothed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as though searching for a map to somewhere he hadn't been in years. I turned off the light and left the room. The next morning was quiet. He had already gone by the time I woke. No note. No message. No indication that anything had changed. And yet everything had. I moved through the morning with calm efficiency. I watered the plants, folded the laundry, wiped down the kitchen counters. The things I'd done for decades now felt like steps in a dance I no longer wanted to perform. By midday, I was standing in the garage again. He was there, waiting, though he didn't expect me. He looked up when I entered. His eyes searched mine, not for approval, not for answers, just for presence. I told him, I said simply. He nodded. I thought you might. We didn't speak more than that. We didn't need to. Instead, he handed me a fresh piece of paper, blank, untouched, and a charcoal pencil. Draw with me today, he said. I paused. Then sat beside him. I hadn't drawn in years. Not since school. Not since life had taken over with its checklists and obligations. My fingers felt stiff at first, unsure. But as I moved the pencil across the paper, a shape began to emerge, not a person, not a thing, but a motion. A moment. The suggestion of something more. He worked beside me, his strokes more confident, more refined. But we shared the same page. Our lines overlapped, diverged, merged again. For the first time, I felt what it meant to create rather than be created. The day passed that way. Quiet. Focused. Whole. When I left the garage that evening, the sky was soft with late light. I stood on the porch and looked out across the lawn, the trees bending gently in the breeze. And I thought, not about endings or beginnings, but about the space in between. Where things shift. Where we choose. Where we begin to see ourselves, clearly, fully, for the very first time. The gallery was smaller than I expected. Tucked between a florist and a bookstore on a quiet street downtown, it had wide windows and whitewashed walls that caught the late afternoon light just right. I hadn't planned to come, not really. I'd told myself I might visit, someday, eventually, but not now. Not so soon. And yet, here I was. The invitation had arrived in the mail a week earlier, plain and unassuming, with my name handwritten on the envelope in neat, deliberate letters. No note. No explanation. Just a date, a time, and a name on the printed card inside. His name. The day I received it, I tucked it inside the kitchen drawer and closed it as if that act alone could keep me from remembering what we had created in that garage, in silence and light and pencil strokes that meant far more than we ever dared to speak aloud. But something in me had shifted again since then. Not out of guilt or hope, but because the quiet between us had become permanent. He had gone, moved away, the garage locked, his brushes packed. No goodbye, just a stillness I had learned not to fight. And now, he was here. Or at least, his work was. The woman at the gallery entrance gave me a polite nod as I stepped inside, her eyes glancing quickly at my coat, my shoes, the hesitation in my posture. I walked slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps fall into sync with the soft music playing somewhere overhead. The space was bright and open, but intimate too, like it was built to protect what hung on its walls. I moved past the first pieces, landscapes, abstract work, quiet studies of hands in motion. His early style was still there, familiar and earnest, but something had evolved in the way he held light, in the way the subjects breathed from the canvas. Then I saw it. Not a title. Just a number. The placard beside it read simply, Untitled, number 27. But I knew. I stood in front of the painting for a long time. It wasn't a portrait in the traditional sense. There was no detailed face, no background to anchor it. Just the suggestion of a figure in motion, shoulders turning slightly away from the viewer, hair swept up, the curve of a spine drawn with a single bold line. She wasn't looking out. She was looking in. Not caught, but aware. Present. Whole. There was something achingly familiar in the posture, something that made my throat tighten. Not because it exposed me, but because it honored me. Every inch of the canvas whispered, I see you. Not as an object. Not as a memory. But as someone who had chosen herself. I didn't realize how long I'd been standing there until a couple passed by behind me, their quiet conversation carrying words like movement, elegance, truth. They didn't know it was me. Of course not. The painting didn't offer names. Only presence. I turned to move on, but something caught my eye, a small square table near the corner with a guest book laid open beside a single chair. I walked over, slowly, and picked up the pen without yet knowing what I'd write. The pages were filled with short remarks. Praise. Reflection. Names I didn't recognize. I found a blank line and wrote. You taught me how to see myself. Thank you. I didn't sign it. There was nothing else to say. Outside, the air was warm. The city moved around me, unaware of what I'd left behind in that quiet room. I walked for a while, nowhere in particular, just letting the rhythm of my steps ground me in the now. Back home, the house was as I'd left it. Familiar. Lived in. But not unchanged. My husband had returned to his routines, speaking only of work, of deadlines, of weather patterns and grocery lists. We hadn't mentioned the note. We hadn't mentioned the absence that had followed it. But there was a new space between us, not angry, not cruel. Just wide and open, like a hallway without doors. And in that space, I had begun to exist again. I didn't need to fill it. I didn't need to explain it. I simply let it be. That evening, I made tea and sat by the window, letting the day settle into my skin. I thought of the painting again, of the way it hadn't asked for permission, the way it had claimed its place on the wall without apology. I closed my eyes. And I knew I wasn't returning to who I had been. I was becoming someone else. Not a muse. Not a wife. Not even a subject. Just a woman, quietly, fully, finally, alive.